G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Jennifer Macy, the podcast producer for Follow the Money, and I'm filling in for Ebony Bennett, the Deputy Director at the Institute, who's taking a short but well-earned break. Today we're bringing you more guests from our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. It's been almost 30 years since Australia signed on to the UN Climate Change Convention. And in that time, Australia's emissions have gone up, not down. Australia's policy to meet the latest climate agreement, the Paris Accord, relies heavily on leftover credits it was given from the last UN agreement, which will keep emissions about where they are now. And as part of Australia's COVID economic recovery plan, the federal government is proposing a tech roadmap that has no destination. There's no climate target beyond 2030, and instead of investing in renewables, we have a push on gas. Australia is among the top 20 polluters in the world, but when you look at its exported emissions from all the coal and gas it ships overseas, then Australia's carbon footprint triples. Yet it's within Australia's scope to change, and that's the key message from today's webinar guest, Craig Reucassel. His newest TV series is called Fight for Planet A on the ABC, which you can catch on iView.
Enough is enough.
Australia, it's time to think about our carbon footprint.
This is no longer an argument about science, but a case for saving the planet.
Are you with me, guys?
In this series, we'll meet those who raised the alarm decades ago.
By the early 1980s, I knew.
Listen to those who'll inherit this problem.
I'm terrified.
We will never back down!
I challenge billion-dollar businesses to do better.
We've got 20 million trees for Chevron. There's 20 million. Can you give us a hand with them?
And hold our government leaders accountable.
Definitely be talking to the Prime Minister about this.
God, Prime Minister! Why is he trying to run away then?
I'll show you what households can do to reduce our carbon footprint.
Who's ready for a climate challenge?
Yeah!
By experimenting with our diet, our energy habits and how we get around.
That is crazy.
To find out if together we can make a real difference.
Craig Reucassel joins Richie Merzian, Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Australia Institute, and Leanne Minshall, the Director of the Australia Institute, Tasmania. They talked about the possibility of a green recovery, how to empower Australians to do their part, but more importantly, how to push for government and large corporate emitters to act on climate change. This was recorded live on Wednesday the 9th of September 2020, and things may have changed since recording.
So Fight for Planet A was a three-part doco. It looked at our energy emissions, our transport emissions, our food emissions, and explored what people can do in that personal action, that personal capacity. One thing we're hoping to do today, Craig, is explore that a bit further, not just what people can do individually, but also what they can do politically. Because if most of our emissions are in things that are outside our immediate control in terms of what we consume and what we drive, what we eat, then how do we actually address the overall picture as well as the immediate one in front of us? And so maybe that's where we'll kick things off with a question, and of course, welcome to open with anything you like as well. But how did you find that balance between empowering people, making it accessible for people to engage in climate change and the personal actions they could take forward, whilst also balancing the broader political space where a lot of the decisions made at that higher level are driving Australia's oversized emissions?
Yeah, it was a really hard balance, and I hopefully for anyone who's watching. By the way, I'm coming from the Gadigal, from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to recognise their elders, both past and present. It was a big balance, and for anyone who hasn't seen the show, you can watch it on iView. It would be wrong to suggest that we only suggested personal changes as the only way. We talked about gas companies, we talked about our electricity grids, we talked about government action, all those kind of things as well. But there's a couple of reasons that we did look at personal change, and there's several reasons, to be honest, for that. One of the reasons was that in doing a lot of research for this show, I think there's a realization that there's a great deal of misunderstanding about climate change and about the causes of it. And, you'd see polling suggesting, for instance, that people were asked about what are you doing to stop climate change, they'd say, well, I don't take plastic bags from Coles or Woolies. Important issue, important waste issue, obviously ties into war on waste and that kind of stuff. That's an important thing, but that's obviously not a big mover and shaker when it comes to actual carbon emissions. So one of the problems we face when kind of talking about policy, and one of the reasons that I think our politics can be so clouded when it comes to election time, you can say you're going to steal the weekend, is that there's obviously, if you don't have a lot of understanding within the broader population, it makes it a lot easier to bullshit the population. So part of it is actually about getting that base understanding to start with. Now, that understanding comes a lot easier if you start with things that people understand. If you start with people that people think engage with it on a daily basis. The number of times I try to think of a really simple way to communicate the complexity of the electricity grid in Australia and failed, is overwhelming. So you really do need to look at it from a perspective where people can understand it. I think that's the first thing, is that getting an understanding of where the problem comes from and seeing where you contribute to it is part of that, but also showing that you can actually get a solution, you can actually be part of the solution is a second thing. There's a second step to that, though. If you start engaging with your own footprint, you start looking at it, you will start hitting a lot of walls. You'll hit a great deal of walls. I hit walls all the time when I try to reduce my footprint. And that walls will go, oh, the reason that wall is there is because government or another actor is not doing anything to change, despite the fact that they may be saying they are doing something. So it's also about saying, you undertake this personal action and see how far you get before you run into a wall that's been put there by a lack of government action. And that comes up quite often in these things. A third thing I would say, and this is probably the depressing part of it, and by the way, thanks for saying there's no doom or gloom. I thought there was plenty of doom and gloom in it, Richie. The third part about it, and this is actually depressing, is that put aside all that stuff about, everything about how we're going to change people's behaviour and how that will change how they engage with the issue and how it will change whether they engage politically or otherwise. We have been so goddamn terrible in this country at reducing our emissions. If you look at how much so last year, we actually had a reduction in emissions. We've gone down 3 times in the last 6 years. So we've kind of gone up and down over the last few years. We've moved almost nowhere in terms of reduction in emissions. So last year, when the government was saying, hey, look, we're so frigging great, we've done some reductions, we're talking about 5 million tonnes of CO2 equivalents. Now, in Australia, we have nearly 10 million households. Getting half of those households to cut a tonne off their carbon footprint is actually bloody easy. It's really simple. I mean, probably, to be honest, if everyone just signed up to green power, you'd probably do it overnight. And that would have flow-on effects in terms of the grid as well. So sadly, when people say, well, individual action can't do anything, in Australia, the bar is being set so goddamn low that individual action can do things. Now, I'm not saying that we should then only rely on individual action, because obviously we have a much bigger challenge ahead of us that needs it. But yeah, in Australia, it's so goddamn frustrating that individual action can make a difference, which is terribly sad in some ways, given how much more power government has to affect change and business as well. So that would be my summary, the answer to your question.
I just to jump in quickly for a second, I've been taking questions for the past few days online, Craig, and a lot of them are around what personal action can be taken. We've got one woman called Tina, her son was so inspired, he's made a whole feature-length film in 5-minute parts called Now, in capitals. But we've got another lady, Shirley from the Blue Mountains, who her question was, she would like to know from you what you're proudest of in terms of changing your own personal footprint, and what you think you have to do better on.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm proudest. When I was looking at this, I was proudest that I kind of got into green energy so many years ago and have been doing it for years. Also been slowly over time trying to increase things like solar and reduce that kind of thing. I'd say probably electricity is where I'm a little bit better. I'm not great on the food front. I am not a vegetarian, despite the fact that I'm very much trying to limit my red meat consumption.
You don't look like you eat too much.
Thank you. Yeah, I only drink beer during COVID. But transport's a tough one. And transport's an interesting one, actually, because I found it was an area where it's one of those ones where I feel like you hit the wall of the government inaction a lot sooner than in some of the other areas. So yeah, that's one where I kind of tussle with it. I have good months and bad. So yeah, look, it's a journey. It's not an overnight thing, and this is the process. And it's also, I'm not calling for perfection from anyone. It's about everyone. You know, we want to make it more accessible that everyone realizes they can do something, even if you can't get to zero carbon. You can actually make a difference.
Transport is a good one to explore because it is somewhere where the government has no policy around incentivizing low emission vehicles. There's no fuel standards to reduce
That's
emissions.
An outrage, Richie. The governments over the last 10, 15 years have released at least 5 discussion papers. And these are very powerful discussion papers. They involve a lot of discussion.
But we're discussing right now
the same thing that they discussed years ago, and then there's nothing about it. Do you not understand the power of discussion paper technology, Richie? How dare you talk down?
If only discussion papers brought down emissions, we'd be leading the world by the sound of it.
Well, it just so happens that today is a World Electric Vehicle Day. And one of my favorite bits, hands down, from the show, Craig, was when you jumped into a Tesla Model S and then drag raced a Holden supercar and just demolished it and left a whole bunch of rev heads kind of slack-jawed, staring and wondering what the future was going to look like. What can we do to accelerate the uptake of electric vehicles? In the absence of any policies, lots of discussion papers, but absence of any policies or anything in the transport sector, and I think less than 1% of new car sales being EVs right now.
Yeah, it's really hard, this one. And so firstly, just in terms of that drag race, I would say that the David Sultana, the guy that we drag race, was actually fantastic about it. You can see his actual excitement at seeing, the next step. Like afterwards, he's like, I want to get one of these Teslas. And he's probably got a lot better chance of buying one than I do. So, it's interesting to see that interaction. But I did that partly because I wanted to respond to the kind of ridiculousness of, that Australia likes cars with grunt, but also because I wanted to sneak in the graphic showing charging electric car off the grid, because it's a really good question. It's often asked. It's often asked as a kind of, I'm going to get you here, but what if you're charging your electric car off the grid? Because it's all the coal in the grid, isn't it just as bad as petrol cars? Now, it's better than petrol cars, but it's still not as good as it could be. And that shows, again, how our electricity grid is such a problem. So that's the reason why I wanted to do that, as well as the enjoyment or fear of drag racing a Tesla. But yeah, it's interesting. This is one where I find that you do have a real problem with, and I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg argument. So let's put aside the federal government for a second. We do have state governments and councils who seem to be trying to engage with the issue of electric cars. But the chicken and egg for them is going, well, there's so few people with electric cars. Why would I put, infrastructure? Why would I put an electric car charger out and about? And the people who are going, well, why would I buy an electric car charger? Because there's no chargers around. I mean, me personally, I have no off-street parking. I did talk to my councillor about whether it was illegal to drape, chargers across the pavement. They didn't seem to think it was a great idea. But so you've got that first chicken and egg problem, which is that, we don't have the infrastructure, so you're less likely to invest in an electric car. You have the second chicken and egg problem, which is that right now, if you look at countries overseas like Norway, there's a massive waiting list for electric cars. It's a huge waiting list. And a lot of countries that actually have proper electric car policies have waiting lists to get electric cars. So why would you, as an Australian car manufacturer, bring electric cars into a country that has almost no demand for them? It's really the reason why Tesla's kind of leads, is that they only have electric cars, so that they kind of respond to that. So it's frustrating, because I think we really do need positive policies in that. And I think councils can do it. Like, I do think state governments and councils working together to kind of go, hey, let's look at Sydney or whatever. Let's start putting the infrastructure in place to make it so people go, I could be charging my electric car here, or it's, to overcome that fear of range anxiety is a big part of it. And I also I do want to say, I think one fault of the show, if I can criticize my own show, is, and we weren't able to, just because of time constraints and money and all that. I would have liked to also have given some families a hybrid car as well, because in terms of currently, if you look at emissions of cars in Australia, if you go to Green Vehicle Guide and you look at that kind of stuff, in terms of life cycle emissions, a lot of the hybrid cars that are out there now are going to be probably the lowest cars you can take. They're also a lot more accessible, a lot cheaper. we've seen recently kind of massive. I think it's 80% of RAVs are now being sold through Toyota hybrid cars, and that, it's not getting rid of those emissions, but in terms of current steps now, it's a really positive step in terms of reducing emissions. So, it doesn't have to be, even in countries like Sweden and Norway and that. Most of those countries still have a higher take-up of plug-in hybrids. Norway has battery hybrids. The others have a high take-up of plug-in hybrids. So even for those people saying, a bit of range anxiety, I'm a bit worried if I run out of charge, you go, well, plug-in hybrids are another option, and they do exist in Australia. So there are other options out there, and it doesn't just have to be battery-powered electric vehicles as the solution. You can look at other solutions that are currently there now, but it really does need, for us to make that next step, really needs a bit of positive government action, and whether that's at a state level or council level, I don't know. But if you're waiting for that, and again, Richie, you shouldn't be critical of the federal government level, because they did put in windscreen stickers in, I think 2001, was it? And that's been a very effective policy. It's interesting to compare windscreen stickers versus mandatory policies that Europe put in. The jury's still out on which is more successful.
Actually, we've got another question from Steve Gill along those lines of government action. It's a little bit leading. He said, if you factor in all of the state government and council activities, does that basically make the federal government useless and relevant? So I think we know
unfortunately
what
doesn't.
Steve's opinion is.
Yeah, well, at the moment it's kind of is a bit, but the problem is that the federal government still has so much capacity to make the change, and that's realistically right now. It's not a question of climate denial. It was interesting seeing the response to the show. See how the debate has changed. There's very little kind of climate denial response to that. It's climate delay. It's about delaying change. And so if you're, hypothetically speaking, an energy minister in the federal government, you can just slow things down by just slowing down change. And that's what's happening at the moment. But unfortunately, if we had somebody really proactive in that particular role, you could make so many positive changes.
And a good example of that, as you mentioned, is Norway. We have some research coming out through our Nordic Policy Centre that just shows that Norway has just agreed to 100% electric vehicle target for all new car sales by 2025. And that's not including plug-ins. So in the next 5 years, every car sold will be electric. They're at 50% now for electric, with an additional 20% for plug-in. And all of that has been driven by policies. Like their first policy came into place in 1990. And that's stuff like waiving stamp duty, decreasing rego, allowing them to ride bus lanes, get free parking, mandatory charging stations every 50 kilometers. So even though there is that range anxiety, and they have an average commute that's larger than Australia's average commute, people see those charging stations and they have that confidence because the government took those leading steps. So I think there is a lot the federal government can do, but there's no point in waiting, especially now that they've opened up the ability to import second-hand cars now more easily. So I think we'll probably hopefully see more second-hand EVs come through the market too.
Yeah, and that's totally true. This is where it needs the policy to guide it, because it needs to get to some kind of tipping point. We're nowhere near that in Australia. And it's interesting when I was dealing with the kind of the young household of guys in Wollongong who are all students, and realistically, I was like, I can't do anything for you. You shouldn't. It's no responsibility on you. You've got your old parents' secondhand cars and old cheap secondhand cars. Of course, you can't be asked to make a change other than trying to use them less. But if we actually had that kind of policy, whereby at the moment we were having a lot of the first-hand cars that were being bought by the people who had the money, then that has a flow-on effect. It means that 10 years from now, the student cars of the future are electric cars. We just don't have that at the moment. So it really does need some kind of proactive policy on that front. And this is the interesting thing is that, people are fearful of this. And if you go to there is still four-wheel drives in Norway. There are still these kind of things being sold in Norway. You have to, it's not just, there's a lot of carrot involved in this. There's a lot of just promoting positive changes and to the benefit of those that actually take it up. So look, people I know who have gone to electric swear they'd never go back. We've just got to get to the point where we actually get close to a tipping point.
So Craig, moving on to the question of gas, the Minister for Emissions Reductions and Energy is talking about a gas-fired recovery, which seems to run counter to a lot of the research that you presented in the show. And we were fortunate enough to feed some of that research in the context of one gas site in WA, Chevron's Gorgon site, and their inability to bury 3 years worth of emissions, they should have been burying about 80% of that, have not buried any of it. That was equivalent to Australia's annual domestic aviation emissions in 1 year, like 10 million tons that they did bury. And apparently now the solution to COVID is to line up more of our gas resources and to keep going. Like, is this a path we should be taking?
No, it's nuts. Okay, so it's nuts, and let's take it from a different perspective. Like, the irony of it is that Chevron's Gorgon plant is the best standard we have in Australia right now, because now they're carbon capture. Having spent countless billions on carbon capture technology through Australia, generally coming to nothing over the many years. We actually have this plant that has some level of carbon capture and storage. It's not all of it. Its game was about 40%. I'm still not entirely clear if they're hitting that. It doesn't seem that they're hitting that, but they're actually capturing some of it, right? So they're the gold standard right now in Australia. Now, you would think that if that was the case, that new gas LNG plants that were going to be built in Australia would at least go for that standard, but that's not the case. We required this in the 2000s when this was going through to get approval. We required this level. Right now, 15 years later, when we're facing all the challenges that we've already seen from climate change, we're seeing fires throughout Australia, all these other problems, we're not even requiring that level of new gas plants. So let me put it to the Minister for Emissions Reductions. If you want to have a gas-fueled recovery, why don't you say, okay, all gas plants have to be 100% offset or 80% offset. I'd even take that. And then look at the price of that, and then look at the cost of that, and compare it to the fact that already they're being beaten by wind and solar. They're already being beaten by cost. So if the problem is that this is the ridiculousness of it, is that everybody argued for gas and coal because it was the cheapest, and now it's not the cheapest. They're still arguing for it, but they're saying we should subsidise it. I'm not against subsidies, but the reason you subsidise something is you subsidise something that is a benefit to society. And it is not increasing our emissions massively. And reality is sinking more money into gas. It seems nuts. I mean, there's a chance it becomes a stranded asset. If Europe takes the next step and starts to, put kind of trade barriers against countries that have high carbon emissions, Australia's going to be screwed. So it doesn't make sense on so many levels. And I mean, look, there's a lot of data around about this, but it's a highly capital intensive industry. So generally speaking, that means it's going to be really slow to actually get a change. And also that high capital intensive industries generally have low jobs numbers as well. So it doesn't make sense on so many levels. And it's very frustrating to see that being championed as a policy. I mean, that said, I understand that if you put a room full of gas executives together and ask them how to solve a problem, maybe they choose gas. I mean, shit, that's...
It is almost crazy. Like the Economic Recovery Task Force is being led by a whole heap of people with gas interests.
It's almost like that. Almost. Like that. But yeah, look, it's just, this is the thing is that, in Fight for Planet A, we didn't say don't extract gas. I mean, obviously that's a valid argument. But the point is this, that you have to cover the externalities that you're creating. You have to cover the costs that you're creating. Like if somebody said to us, we need a gas-fueled recovery, and to do that, we're going to make sure that gas companies can pump lead and benzene and all these other chemicals into the ocean and into the atmosphere because we need these jobs, everyone would kick up an enormous fuss. Why the hell do we accept that if they put massive amounts of methane and CO2 into the atmosphere, that's an acceptable level? This is it. I'm willing to ask people to make changes in their own life, that kind of thing, but these companies have a much bigger footprint than any of us, and they can make changes, and they've got the money to do it. So, look, it's a ridiculous situation we face.
And you're quite right. We did back of the envelope analysis that shows that you could invest in any other sector of the economy for the same amount of money and create more jobs than you could the gas industry. It is so capital intensive versus jobs intensive that anything, you throw money at any direction and you'll make more jobs.
Richie, this is very concerning that the Australian Institute is using the back of an envelope. I think you should be using much better technology, and you should use a spreadsheet at the very least.
Well, this is part of recycling, though, isn't it? Isn't that part of the solution to climate change?
It's good. As long as you're using a second-hand envelope.
We did use a spreadsheet to work out the full size of Australia's gas reserves and resources. And if we did take a gas-fired recovery and lit all of that up, as industry recommend we do, what would be the global annual emissions worth of burning that? And that research should be coming out tomorrow. So we have used some spreadsheets as well. So
Good to see.
There are. Oh, sorry, Richie, just quickly, because there's been a lot of questions. I should have mentioned at the beginning too to guests that if you hover over the little Q&A icon at the bottom, you can ask questions. But there are quite a lot there from people who are asking around influence and when it comes to lobbying for change for the government, and they're interested to hear both Richie and Craig's ideas on what can be done by individuals.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll jump into that one. There's no shortage of ways that we can tackle government. But I was going to quickly just jump in on food, Craig, because you visited Mark Wooten's cattle farm, and he puts sustainability front and centre. But I guess he's exceptional in that regard. But on the plus side, though, you have a younger generation that is more conscious of the health impacts, of the climate impacts of their food. Is food an area where we could see a far greater impact being made because you have that consciousness building and because it is immediately within your grasp to change?
I want to say yes, but I don't think so. It's fascinating. Look, food is a really tough one. We've had a lot of focus on, the climate impact of food for a lot of years, and it's an area where people are really resistant to change. And I think at the moment, it's not really in the hands of consumers because you don't have that information when you go to a shop. To even get the level of information we had for the show, to even compare several different foods, beer and beef and chicken and kangaroo and all these kind of things, was an absolute goddamn nightmare. And I know that Tesco in the UK actually did try to, I think about 10, 15 years ago, try to put carbon footprints on food and kind of weren't followed by others and kind of fell over in the end. So I think that, look, yes, in terms of your own personal footprint, it is one of the easiest ways you can obviously change that footprint. We were surprised. Like a lot of people said to us, don't do food because people hate being told what to eat. The reason we did it in the end was because A, there's a lot of interesting solutions coming through. And B, when we looked at the individual footprints of families, in some cases, it was actually bigger than their transport or, it was the number 2 there. So it was actually a way to affect change quite quickly. And also because methane, one of the reasons it is important is because a large part of the food footprint is methane. And methane is always talked about as being about 20 to 30 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas. But that's if you're looking at it on a 100-year time scale. If you're looking at it on a kind of 10, 20-year time scale, it's like 80 times more powerful. So it's actually, in terms of getting bang for buck through your change, immediately it has a lot more of an impact. So yeah, I think it's very positive from a personal perspective. You can make changes and to a point and get that change straight away. Overall, I don't feel like it's going to be the easiest way to get change because a lot of information isn't there. Because even the Mark Wooten example, there's very few examples of, Meat and Livestock Australia is saying that they'll be carbon neutral by 2030. Fascinated to watch that. I really am fascinated to see that. And if we can get those kind of movements, the fact that they're saying they're going to do that will have a big impact. But realistically, in terms of the quicker change you can get, Australia has such capacity to have renewable energy on a massive scale, which will bring down electricity prices long term as well, which would help a lot of other things. That's the low hanging fruit as far as I'm concerned in Australia. That kind of food I think is a tricky one. Yeah. As much as I'd love to just say yes to that question.
No, I think you nailed it there. In terms of the disconnect that your show revealed around people's understanding of Australia's role, Australia's emissions, per capita emissions, why do you think there is that disconnect? Because it's not just sort of a tangential question. Like, this impacts people directly. most people are invested in Australia's resources sector through their superannuation. Investments that haven't done well over the last 10 years, if you track them closely, like people are directly impacted by Australia's emissions and its choices, but seem to not really be aware of its role in the whole climate space. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it comes back to that kind of whole thing about CO2 and pollution and that. And then people think of Australia as being a very clean country. You know, you see vision of Mumbai and the pollution there, and therefore you think, oh, we're a lot cleaner than that. So that kind of visible pollution is, I think, where people are responding to, and that's the interesting trick about CO2 and about greenhouse gases, is they're invisible, as Tony Abbott said. That's part of the problem, I think, is that people think of us as being an environmentally quite positive nation, which is interesting. And we are on some factors, but a lot of factors are really bad. And in Australia, a lot of people were shocked that Australia is one of the high, particularly if you do it per capita. It's amazing how, it's very hard to find nations that are worse than us, actually, when we were looking at it. It's like half of the oil states are worse than us too. It's just or are better than us as well. We are really up the top there. And there's so many factors involved in that, but the main one is our electricity, how we create electricity. And by the way, to go to your first point, Richie, that was not us including any of the exports. We were looking at the domestic pollution, and that's where things like LNG have a big footprint here, but have a bigger footprint when sent somewhere else as well. So it's a real surprise to people, and the thing is that we're bigger than we're not only bigger per capita, we're in the, as you say, the top 20. Although God, I can never find the exact figure, and there are so many different ones there.
There are 40 countries with bigger populations than us that have smaller carbon footprints just for domestic emissions.
UK is a great example of that. I mean, the United Kingdom has a smaller emissions, even though it has 2.5 times our population. So it's frustrating. It's a very frustrating position to be in. And look, but I think it's important because the rhetoric that's been used very powerfully by government over the years to kind of play down any importance in our action in Australia is to suggest that we have no impact, we're small, we're 1.3%, that kind of thing. And it's really important for Australians to realise, no, we are a massive part of the footprint. We have a massive capacity to affect change. And even beyond that, even if you were tiny, Australia is so impacted by climate change. Australia is a country that will be hit by fires and droughts and be affected by these kind of things. We need to be one of the countries who's at the forefront of change so that we can be out there telling others they need to change, rather than being the ones dragging us back every time we go to a climate change thing. So look, it's a frustrating position to be in.
Leanne, did you want to go to
you want some more questions now? Yeah, sure. I'll just go down and have a look at what's coming up. I think one of the things, while I'm looking, that interests me about the UK as well is that it's a country like ours. I mean, it's not like ours, but the lifestyle, it's a developed economy. So when I watched the show, I actually watched it on iView last night. I did a quick binge watch of the 3 episodes. And to me, people looked surprised particularly when, you said that the UK had less emissions per capita than what Australia did. Some people are asking around the food. There's a lot of questions on food, and some people are suggesting that we need to do 2 things. One is have less of us, less people, so a population question, which often comes up in these discussions. And also, should we be eating pests? So there is a bit of a movement on, certainly in Tasmania, where we eat the problem, and they're coming up with innovative ways of eating invasive species as a way to reduce impact. Have you got any comments on that?
Look, happy for you to eat pests. Go nuts, definitely. And it's interesting. It's hard with some of those things because it's interesting that kangaroo has a much smaller carbon footprint than beef and lamb. It's interesting that it's a red meat with a lower footprint, but obviously there are other issues involved in the killing of that. So it's not a total solution overall. To come to the population question, population's a factor, but it's not the major factor. And I'd say the reason for that is if you look at it, that if you look at something like Indonesia, that has a massive population, their carbon footprint per person is about 1/10 of ours. It's more about our lifestyle and the way in which we're living that is creating the problem here. So 20 million people using green power has much less of an effect than 5 million people using coal. It's obviously there are some things that are exacerbated through population, but that's depends on the lifestyle of those population. It depends on how much goods they're using, how those goods are created, how much energy they're using, how the energy is created. So it's not. Look, population is not, I think, the solution here. And I think it can. I know it's a very popular kind of 1970s analysis of this problem, but I don't think it's the correct analysis for the problem we face right now. I don't know, Richie, what do you think on that? Like, what's your view on the population thing? Because I'm not saying it has no factor, but it tends to be looked at as the major solution, and it's probably not really going to be a solution.
And also, it's not a solution that's within our control unless we're a government like China and decide to put policies in place to limit children, or if we're like Josh Frydenberg and we're recommending people have more babies for the country. Like, unless you're taking a position in this space, like, it's not immediately up to you.
It's a lot easier to make every bit of energy in Australia renewable than it is to tell everyone to not have kids. I mean, we can barely get people to wear frigging masks during a pandemic, let alone tell them not to have kids. So, good luck.
It's interesting. Like, I know a number of people around my age who are at the stage where they're having children are considering whether that's part of their climate contribution. And I think it's a personal choice that everyone has to come to that in the same way that they choose other ways that they live their life and what their contribution is going to be. The way I personally see it, I've got 2 little kids, but I'm raising them up to be climate warriors. I'm raising them up to be ready to fight the fight. So it really depends on how you want to engage in this space rather than any one prescriptive solution to this.
Yeah.
Would it be okay to go back to the question now around, because there are a lot of questions.
The lobbying
Actually, there's 2 parts to it. One is, Craig, when are you going to run to be a politician, and why aren't you already one? A few people have asked that. And then the other part of the question is, how do people actually effectively lobby for change? Not everybody can. I loved it, by the way, when you chased the Prime Minister with the balloons attached to your back. I thought that was fab. But those 2 questions.
I would suggest, by the way, that chasing a politician with balloons or a large ball covered in plastic bags is actually not a very good way to lobby. I'd say it's probably counterproductive in some ways. So don't look to that as a solution there. Look, it's a really interesting one, and I'm actually working on a documentary at the moment that looks at the effect of money and lobbying in politics. And I think that you can't really understand Australia's climate policy over the last period, 10, 20 years without understanding that as a factor. Although I don't think it's the only factor. Like, I think it's also, it's a bit more complex than that, but it's definitely been a major factor involved in that. And I think that part of that is to recognise that, yes, politicians have gas executives or whatever, or donors in their ears, but they're also very sensitive to the community. And it actually goes back to that first question from Richie, is that I think if people see polling that says 85% of Australians think climate's a problem and they want something done about it, but then they're getting very few letters coming through their postbox rather than just from a small proportion of the electorate. And when push comes to shove, they're like, nah, these people, when you push them on it, they're like, yeah, we should do something about the climate. Oh, I'm not going to give up my V8, that kind of thing. If politicians are getting that kind of feedback, they're like, okay, there's a bit more nuance to this, to this debate, and it's not as demanding as it seems to be. So what I think is important is for people to be in touch with their politicians in a polite manner, to be honest, and kind of saying to them, like, if a politician's getting lots of letters from people in their constituency saying, hi, I really would love to have an electric car, but there's just no infrastructure here. Every letter is taken as the view of 10, 20, 100 people, that kind of thing I think there's a very important role for, protests and Extinction Rebellion and that kind of stuff. But there's also a role for other people who are not going to do that kind of thing, who may well be Liberal voters. Good on you. That's fine. There's many people who are Liberal voters who are concerned about the climate, who should be trying to kind of change the debate within their own party as well. And that can be done with polite letters or discussions or going along to meetings and talking to people. I think that we need that kind of lobbying coming from the community happening on all different levels, to be honest. So that the kind of, if you're getting the lobbying coming from the fossil fuel sector over here, and obviously they're big donors, it's hard to compete on that level. But if you're getting the lobbying from the other parts of the community, and it feels like it's not just the extremists, it's this part of the community as well. And so I got a lovely letter from an old lady who is concerned about her grandkids' future as well. If it's coming from all those things, politicians are attuned to that, and they won't all respond. There's, I can't see Matt Canavan changing next week, but there are a lot of people who will respond to that. So I think you need to recognise that lobbying, the power of the community to also lobby in a sense is a real thing.
And your own political aspirations, given that we've got a lot of questions on it.
No. I have followed politicians and politics for too many years to think I should go into politics. I sometimes feel for them. I'm one of the few people in Australia that sometimes feels for politicians. Yeah. And this is actually, to be fair, this is an interesting thing. Like, this goes back again to one of the reasons why it's important to have the population pushing for change, because it was interesting. I came from a kind of political science background, and I think I went into war on waste with a very old-fashioned view of power. Like, you just lobby the politician and they change the laws and it all fixes. And in actual fact, the change that tend to come after the War on Waste show tend to be more bottom-up. It tend to start from the public, and then it would permeate the councils, and then might have gone to state government. And the federal government was kind of the last to respond. And I think similarly with this is, the climate needs more of that. Climate change also needs more of that. Not I'm saying it hasn't happened. I mean, there's been enormous amounts of really important and fantastic, civil action happening in Australia for many years. I'm not saying it's started, but it just needs more of it to put that pressure on politicians. I had politicians saying to me, "We don't lead, we follow." And that's something to remember.
You don't often see that on their bumper sticker around election time,
No,
though, do you? Your MPs following you.
Yeah.
And do you have plans, a few other questions around what you've got? Are you going to take Fight for Planet A further? Some people, I think it's Steve is asking if you were considering making board games from it, but I guess in general, I think that would be like
I have not had that
except
question.
for the family
I love
climate
doing something
change.
like this and getting a new question. That's great. Board games. So yes, I would love to take Fight for Planet A further. There were things that we didn't get to. I think that in terms of the stuff I wanted to cover in that show, we didn't get to a lot of things. And for instance, we particularly didn't get to, I guess, your financial footprint, your superannuation, your banking and all that kind of stuff. We did kind of look into it, but unfortunately didn't quite get it there. I think in the end, we ended up spending a lot more time on the kind of simple stuff of what is climate change, where does it come from, what is its effect, than we thought we would. So I guess we didn't get as much. So I'd love to do a second series, and we'll see what happens. See what happens on that front. As for board games, I have not thought of that yet. If a board game based recovery, maybe.
Well, there is someone asking actually if you're going to make this into a DVD. I didn't know that that DVDs were still made. But...
No one makes DVDs. There's a book coming out. I will be putting out a book in November. DVDs, I don't know about DVDs. You can watch it on iView, guys, for the foreseeable future. I'm with you. I love a good DVD, but they tell me no one's got a DVD player anymore.
Craig, in terms of personal action or political action or political influence, one thing that you were able to cover at the very start of the first episode with the school climate strikes. What are your thoughts around that kind of political engagement and how to maybe turn that or manifest that into an actual direct impact? And I think, for example, of like the Cedar Warringah going from Tony Abbott as the representative to Zali Steggall, where you couldn't be any more different in terms of their climate leadership.
Yeah, look, I think that the student strike movement and the student campaigns has been a crucial part of changing the debate, to be honest. I think it's been really fantastic. It's such a great movement, and I think it is one where it's interesting. I think it's a movement where at times it's gotten through to different generations in a way that might not have if it was somebody from their own generation speaking. It was interesting going to that climate change march in Sydney. We were trying to film it, and at times we were like, I can't see a bloody student anywhere. There was just so many parents and grandparents and people came down from their offices and joined in. And it's really important that. I think it's important that that movement doesn't get taken over. On that day, it felt like it was a lot of adult movements trying to take over the student movement. I think it's really important that doesn't happen. I think it's really important that movement maintains student leadership and a student voice because that's what's made it so effective. In terms of I think that has an effect at so many levels. It's a filtering level. It's really complex the way the power works. I mean, Zali Steggall was a fascinating campaign, I guess, because what's interesting about it though is that firstly, Zali's, I think there's an incorrect analysis of the last election because it was framed as a climate change election, and because the Liberal Party then won. It's been framed as if the climate change stuff was not important. If you actually look at a lot of Conservative seats and city seats, they actually did go away from Conservative parties, and I think that the climate change was a very big part of that. Tony Abbott's seat was probably one of the only ones that really flipped, but that's because there were extra reasons why he may not have been particularly loved. Would be how I put that. But yeah, I think that both Liberal and Labor parties would be foolish to misinterpret the last election and to not understand how much passion there is in the community and to not really be adapting to that. And again, this is it. Like, it's not a bloody, in so many countries around the world, it's not a partisan issue. It's not a left-right issue. It's not a Conservative Labor issue. Unfortunately, in Australia, it's become that. It was kind of weaponized by Tony Abbott around climate tax, and it's become that, but not by nature that. I mean, we saw Trent Zimmerman the other day kind of responding to Malcolm Roberts about his idiocy and defending climate change action. I think we need to get it back to that level. And that's why I say, you don't have to be Extinction Rebellion. If you're a member of the Liberal Party, go to your local branch meeting and try to change that internal politics that's going on there, because that's a very important part about it as well. So look,
Maybe someone could suggest that Matt Canavan join Tony Abbott in his trade mission for the UK. That would be
Yes. That's been important work for coal. I mean, that's one of the interesting things. Have you noticed that, like, it's interesting that even now there's very few people in the federal government level really pushing coal. It's kind of like if you're a fossil fuel cheer squad, you're really pushing gas now. Even there, you've moved on from coal. You have to. It's so foolish to make the argument to build a new coal-fired power station that it falls upon very few people to make that argument.
It's a tough sell, a new coal-fired power station, even if you pay for the proposal as the federal government is finding. I mean, if you look at the national electricity market in 2018 and 2019, there were more breakdowns in the newest coal-fired power stations in Queensland per unit of energy than the older ones. So it's not even that the new ones are more reliable; they're more expensive and they're more high polluting. So it's a tough sell, which is why I think if the market is left to it, it won't build any more coal-fired power stations in this country.
Absolutely.
You talk about whether you could do a sequel for the show, or whether it goes to DVD, or a whole variety of other ways. But what is unique is that it doesn't seem like a lot of these stories are being told, whereas we've had decades of being told that Australia derives a good amount of its wealth from the resources that it extracts and the need to protect those resources. And poll after poll shows that people often overestimate the number of jobs or the amount of income coal mining, gas mining bring to Australia. Like, what do you think we need to do to tackle that lack of information around the resources sector and the role that it plays and the broader impacts it has? And is that maybe the space for a sequel?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, it's I think it's on the iView website. We did have a great chat with some people in Victoria who had lost their jobs when coal-fired power station had closed down there, and it was fascinating to see some of them were working in renewable energy. But even those that weren't, it was really a fascinating chat because they were kind of also going, we don't understand why the government hasn't moved to the next step. They're kind of saying a lot of the infrastructure that's here that was used for coal can be used for the next step. You know, there's a lot of people in that industry, they're engineers. They're actually equally frustrated by the lack of government action as others. And I think this is the important thing to recognise. I don't think, despite the rhetoric, I don't think that the protection of coal is necessarily about protecting the jobs of the workers in the plants and the mines. I think a lot of the time it's about protecting the bigger industry and some politics behind that. I think the reality is that the sooner we get on to trying to help those people transition into jobs that are going to have a longer lifespan, the better. Because what you saw when the Hazelwood power station shut down was it was that kind of surprise. They hadn't been preparing for it. And the transition was done really well by Victoria, but we need to be far more prepared for this. We need to be kind of really, I don't want anybody, I don't think people who work in coal power stations or coal mines should be in any way bearing the brunt of this change. It's not their fault. They are working in an industry that we gave a lot of prominence to and we did benefit from. But now that we know what we do, we have to make that transition, and they shouldn't be bearing the pain of that. That's where you need a government that's actually being proactive and saying, okay, we're going to create jobs in those areas for those people. We're going to transition them into those jobs because, they shouldn't be left holding the can for this.
Well, the Australia Institute's done a lot of work over the years, not just on back of envelopes, on around the amount of people that are actually employed in the coal industry, and it's a very, very minor industry, and it's shrinking. And that's not taking away from those individuals with those jobs. Every job is important to the person who holds it. But as a policy driver, it's a very small part of the employment market. And I think absolutely, I agree with you. It's used as a weapon rather than a genuine concern. If it was a genuine concern for people losing their jobs, you don't get that same sort of outcry when 5,000 people from the finance industry were sacked in the mid 90s, or the things that are going on now.
That's fair because that's the finance industry. That's fine.
Yeah, I know.
I'm kidding.
We've got, just thinking around the student strikes, we've actually got quite a few young people coming in with questions. And just to say again, I'm just really thrilled how many people have come on to this webinar. I mean, we've got, at the moment, we're still on 2,500. I think we spiked at nearly 3,000 about 20 minutes ago. So I don't know what we started talking about 20 minutes ago, but we lost a couple. Maybe it was just cuppa time. But it's an extraordinary amount of people coming on, and they're from all across the country. We've got people in Queensland, Western Australia, basically all the states. I can't see anywhere where we haven't got coverage. And I just want to go to a couple of the questions from the younger folk. We've got Edith, who's 7 years old, and she thinks electric cars cost too much. And
yes, I agree.
I love it that Edith can't drive for another 11 years, but she's already got her eye on the prize.
You'd be surprised how many 10-year-olds love Teslas. No, but this is it again, because that's the problem. Is in Australia we have very little supply, and we have nothing actually promoting it or cutting that price down. So again, it requires government action, not a discussion paper.
Yeah. Another one. I think actually this is an anonymous participant, but they're wanting to know if you think that this type of thing, Planet A type programs, should be part of the education curriculum.
Oh, look, I hope so. I hope it gets shown in schools. That'd be great. I think it's the best part about doing the War on Waste is how many kids came up to me in the street and said, we watched it at school and we're doing this at the school, or we're doing this at home, or I hustled my parents and now we're doing this. So absolutely, I hope they do watch it in schools, because unfortunately we're leaving most of the work to them.
A few young people are asking about civil disobedience, which you touched on a little bit with your thinking balloons is not the way to go. But I guess more generally, the question, there's a few of them, and the question centres on what do you feel about civil disobedience as a tool for change?
I think it's an important part of change. As I said, we need we need pressure on an enormous amount of levels at the moment. It needs to be coming from, Extinction Rebellion. It needs to come from civil disobedience. It needs to come from the boardrooms of Australia. And we are seeing some businesses who are doing that and leading as well. So we really genuinely need that pressure to come from so many places at the moment. We have the power in Australia is very fractured, and it needs to be very clear that it's a very strong majority of people that think we've left this too late. We need change now to actually get that kind of change. Because unfortunately, it's a strong vested interest in Australia to push back the other way.
Did you get much public pushback on Planet A, like either in the streets when you were filming or subsequent to its release?
No, a lot less than I thought. And it's interesting as well that the kind of pushback that did come from, Sky News or whatever was of a kind of, it was interesting to see. I think that the debate has slightly changed. It's interesting that even some of the more extreme climate denialists of probably 5 years ago in the kind of national debate have started to backtrack from that position and have tried to take on a different type of position. And I think the evidence is overwhelming, the sentiment is overwhelming, and that's why the problem is we need real action now. I mean, we cannot be investing in gas right now. We need to be investing in the kind of battery storage and the kind of pumped hydro and that kind of thing, which can make our grid be able to handle far more renewable energy as we move forward. We should be investing that right now. And unfortunately, every bit of delay to that just pushes it down the road.
Richie, do you have anything you want to say?
You're on mute, Richie.
There we go. Thanks, Craig. That's the line of the century. The cost of climate inaction. We saw that potentially $100 billion cost in the last summer, the Black Summer bushfires. We're seeing this in terms of the summer of disasters Queensland had with floods. We're seeing this with the hailstorms, with a whole variety of climate impacts. We're proposing a fossil fuel production levy, $1 for every tonne of embedded emissions in the coal and gas that Australia mines and produces. Like, how do we find ways to cover the mounting bill that is climate inaction?
Absolutely. I think that's a good idea, because the reality is that what we're doing now, and talking about the younger generation, is what we're doing right now is if you have a fossil fuel company that digs up coal or gas, exports it and makes money and doesn't pay for the carbon emissions involved in that, what you are doing is passing the bill of that onto the next generation. You are passing that on to your kids. It's a massive bill. So if they're not paying for either getting rid of the emissions or paying for dealing with the kind of the change that will occur and the problems that are created by that, then you're just passing it on to the next generation. And you're essentially getting, you're getting Chevron shareholders are getting a massive kickback from the next generation, from the children who will take over. And that is, as they say in the classics, bullshit.
Okay, well, that brings us just about to time. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. So I'd like to thank Richie and also Craig and everyone, the thousands of people who joined us today and all of their great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I tried to pick out the themes that were coming through the most.
This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so stay tuned. Check out our website, tai.org.au/webinars to register. For the latest health information, check health.gov.au or listen to the ABC's excellent CoronaCast podcast, which comes out daily. You can visit tai.org.au for all of the latest research and content. And we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. Richie Merzian is at Richie Merzian. Leanne Minshall is at Leanne Minshall with a ULL, and Craig Reucassel is at Craig Reucassel. My Twitter handle is at Jennifer Macy. And our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum. Remember, as Ebony would say, stay 1.5 metres away, keep washing those hands, wear a mask if you can, and thanks for listening.